You're probably aware of some of the causes for the loss of biodiversity and the decline of populations. I'm going to cover a few more and then we'll move into conservation ecology. So, as the populations shrinks, it's going to encounter two problems. It's going to lose the genetic diversity and the geographic area over which it occurs that becomes smaller. So, the species disappears from the parts of its range. So that's gonna make the population even more vulnerable to further decline. So many species today they are, less in numbers than they once were. They occupy less area than they once did, and they are trying to do some efforts to save the decline of the populations. So several causes. I'm not gonna cover all of them. I'm gonna cover a few of them. So several causes are so one of the causes that is um, causing biodiversity loss is habitat fragmentation. So I want you to look at this picture. This is the original habitat. Over time, there are some gaps from habitat becoming fragmented, and over time, they're getting larger and larger. And look how much space is there now. So when there's more space and less of the trees where the species can stay, they're going to disappear. And this is called habitat fragmentation. So the habitat's getting smaller. So for example, sometimes they make roads through the mountains, or here in Serengeti, the highway where would have caused habitat fragmentation and loss of biodiversity. So habitat loss has affected every biome, whether it's a wetland or if it's terrestrial. So here it is showing the percentages of habitat lost, 0 to 100, and this is different type of biome that we covered. And then this is showing how much it's being lost by human use. So this picture right here is showing a prairie pothole, wetlands, lakes and ponds that were once abundant. They have been, and this is Great Plains, and that have been drained for farming. So habitat loss is the primary source of population decline because if they don't have anywhere to stay, it's obviously gonna decline. Poaching is illegal killing of wildlife, and they do it for meat or body parts, and most likely to experience case selection species. And just to remind you, case selection species are the species that make few offsprings, that produce few offsprings, but they put a lot of care in the parental care into their offspring. So elephants an example, humans are an example of key selected species. So sometimes they take their body parts to sell them, and that's poaching. Invasive species are non-native species being introduced into new environments, and sometimes they think that it can help, so they introduce it, but then it turns out like it wasn't really helpful. So, for example, this gypsy moth was introduced in the Massachusetts in the hope that it could produce silk, and the moth failed to do so. Instead, spread across the eastern United States, where its outbreaks defoliate trees over large regions every year. This emerald ash borer was transferred by accident through wood materials or something somewhere, and this caused a lot of habitat loss, not habitat loss. This beetle came in wood packing material by accident, and then it killed a lot of ash trees. So that was an accident. So there are other examples here. You can read about it. Right here is actually this one. So you can read about this. Sudden oak death, that's another one. So this disease has killed more than 1 million oak trees in California since 1990s. So this is water mold, and it was introduced by infected nursery plants by accident, and scientists are concerned about the damage to eastern U.S. forest. So for many species, there are multiple factors that are causing the decline, and amphibians is one example. So this is a golden toad, and this is one of at least 170 species of amphibians that have suddenly gone extinct in the recent years. And this happened due to drought, climate change, maybe due to disease or habitat loss, which is the main reason for the decline. But most of it remains unexplained. So, like I said, there are multiple factors that can cause it. So, like right here, habitat loss, pollution. Habitat loss is the main one here, but there are other unknown causes as well. Okay, so conservation biology is a study that seeks to understand the loss, protection, and restoration of biological diversity. So, for example, why the population is declining. If it's declining due to human um, activity, how can we protect it? And how can we restore it before it becomes extinct? So, by determining the size, so they use a lot of, they collect data on it. They do a lot of, examining the data and see how they can help the wildlife. And what can they do they do experimentation to see what they can do to increase the size of a population. Small and isolated populations are most vulnerable, and they're the ones that might, if they're small in numbers, they might go extinct. So they get special attention. Right here, this picture is just to show you historically, if the population has been declining, they are increasing the conservation efforts to make more sustainable production, and they're doing more conservation efforts to save the populations. I'm sure you guys know about Endangered Species Act that offers protection for the species. So there's two types, endangered or threatened. Endangers, they're in danger of becoming extinct in the future. Threatened, they're likely to become endangered soon. So they're not good either. They're also in danger. So ESA um, forbids U.S. government and citizens from taking actions that might destroy the individuals within those species. So they can add if they're seeing that the population is getting small, it's in danger, they can take that species, they can add it to the list, and they can say nobody can harm the species, you can't hunt them, you can't remove them from the habitat. So they can do certain actions. So they are not always stop the development products, and they can promote cooperation with the landowners. So, for example, habitat conservation plans, they allow landowners to harm some individuals of the species if the overall habitat is improved. So, it's overall is helping the population, then they can remove a few of them. And a safe harbor agreement is a promise that government will not pursue additional action if the landowner pursues the actions that assist in the species recovery. An example of this is the sage grouse. This is the greater sage grouse. So this is an example of a cooperative public-private approach. So this species had been um, uh, so this species was um, was going to be listed as endangered species, but a lot of people, ranchers, and oil and gas industry was opposed to it because the restriction on land use across sagebush regions of the West could complicate the ranching and drilling activities, and as a result, federal agencies they embarked on a campaign with the ranchers and the industry for energy in a lot of states. Uh, so they voluntarily agreed to lessen the impacts on the sage grouse population, in which the bird was not listed as endangered species. So that's an example. Um, so I just want to mention CITES, which is Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So this is pretty much banning the international transport of body parts of rare species. So you can't take them and sell them or do anything like that. And then Convention on Biological Diversity is a treaty providing funding and incentives for conservation efforts in developing countries. So they're the ones that promote the tourism. They promote some sustainable crops. An example of that's shade-grown coffee, discourage use of pesticides, so anything that might harm the species. So captive breeding is, that's something that's being done in the zoos and botanical gardens for the species that are endangered. And they are being bred in captivity. And once that's done, they go back and take them to their natural habitat and reintroduce them. So that's something else that they're working on. So here's an example of California condor. This was a victim of hunting. Um, Condors are, harmless scavengers of dead animals. So people shot them for support, hunting. So then after there was some lead poisoning that happened, some of them got collided with the electrical wires. So anyways, there were only about 22 individuals remaining of condors by 1982. So they did captive breeding, and which was successful, and they were able to increase the number. So look here, it's, going up. So the red is the condors in captivity, and the orange is condors in wild, but the numbers have gone up. I don't know if you guys heard about CRISPR. So that's a type of genetic engineering that they do. They take DNA from endangered species, insert it into egg from a related species that lacks a nucleus, and then implant it into female. So several mammals have been cloned this way, and they believe that extinct species may be recovered from DNA and preserved body parts. So that can happen, and sometimes, or if it's successful, it'll be able to breed. Otherwise, it might not be successful. So sometimes it is successful, sometimes it's not. Uh, Forensic science, as you know about forensics, it's to analyze evidence for a crime. So biologists, conservation biologists, they're using forensics to trace the geographic origins of organisms, or body parts recovered from the black market. So, for example, to determine that if the whales that are legally protected by, the ESA, so they have analyzed some samples of whale meat sold in Asian markets. So by comparing the genetic data from whale populations, these geneticists have identified the species and geographic origin of hundreds of market samples. And they have, um, you know, found illegal hunting whenever they have found whale meat. They have found that there's meat that's labeled as whale meat, but instead came from dolphins or sheep or horses. So those are some things they can do with forensics. So something called umbrella species. So the word umbrella meaning they're kind of like an umbrella to protect many others. So umbrella species are large animals that roam great distances, like lions in Serengeti and wild beast. And because these types of animals require large areas, meeting their habitat needs helps meet those of that are less that don't need as much area, like plants and fungi. People might not be interested in those animals. They might be more interested in those lions. So it helps the animals that are less charismatic. For example, um, they might have a less of a range. So protecting umbrella species helps them protect many other species. So that's all I'm trying to say. And then flagship species, they also promote conservation. So, for example, the symbol of World Wildlife Federation is a giant panda. People might think, oh, panda is cute, so they might support the conservation efforts for that. It's a lovable animal, they might think it's cute, so they might support that. Biodiversity hotspots are regions that support great number of species that are found nowhere else. So, to qualify as a hotspot, a region must harbor at least 1,500 endemic plant species, and in addition, uh, hotspot must already have lost 70% of its habitat to human impact, or it might be at risk. So these areas highlighted in red are biodiversity hotspots. All right, we're at the end of the lecture. So several strategies help protect habitats, communities, and ecosystems. You probably go for a hike and you're not allowed to do certain things in hiking spots or in the national parks where people usually go hiking. So those are protected areas. Um, they they might even charge you a fee for entrance to a national park, and they're using that money to maintain the habitats and ecological services. But they may still be affected by illegal logging, poaching, and resource extraction. Areas of oceans are also beginning to set aside for similar reasons. So ecosystems they can be restored by reestablishing the natural processes that we interrupted. So we kind of have to go backward and fix what we have messed up. So since this chapter's been talking about Kenya and Serengeti a lot, so there are efforts being made to restore heavily defrosted Mao Forest Complex, and that's an area that contains watershed for Masai Mara Reserve. So over the years, so much forest in this densely populated area has been destroyed by agriculture, timber extraction, so the water supply for the wildlife and for the Kenyan people is now threatened. So the government is working with agencies to fund and replant the protect the area for forests. So, like I said, it's kind of going backwards now. So the damage that they did, they're trying to fix it. So in the past, conservations from developed countries would work to preserve ecosystem while neglecting the needs of local people. But now, due to these community-based conservation, they're trying to work with the local people. So Maasai had been forcibly evicted from the Serengeti and forbidden from hunting wildlife, but they're not giving some authority over the wildlife management. So this approach would be vital to preserve biodiversity in the face of growing future human population, especially because local people they know the most about the area. So they're trying to work with them to see if the conservation process can be accelerated.